Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hai Nguyen again, and this is it, right? This is it, guys. This is the final Proctor exam to the class. If you're watching this video, it means that you have made it this far through the class. Most likely, you have completed over the 10 modules, the 2 Proctor exams, and also completed the book review. So congratulations for making it this far. Because I know it's not easy to take an online history class at a community college, especially not mine. So look, I know I expected you guys to do a lot of reading and writing over the course. So again, congratulations for making it this far, because if you really think about it, you have written quite a bit, right? Probably 4 to 5 pages for every module. And, the exams themselves were probably another 3 or 4 pages. And if you look at the book review, that's another 5 pages. So if you add it all together, that's like more than 70 pages of writing you have done. So, and think about all the reading that you have done. The textbook, the book that you have selected for your book review. So that's 2 books right there. The countless number of primary resources and also the various films that you have reviewed. So I really do mean that, to congratulate you for making it this far, because not everybody have made it along the way. But anyways, I want to shift gears. I want to talk to you about, because with this video, I want to talk to you about your last assignment, right? You're almost there. You're almost there, guys. But you still have 15% more of the class to go. And what we are talking about is the last and final Proctor exam. And again, I'm not going to go into all the details in terms of the test format, because again, it's the same format as your first 2 midterms. So if you've taken those, it's the same procedure, right? Basically, you need a computer with a webcam, a Chrome browser with a Proctored app installed, and ultimately have your valid form of ID, and ultimately prepare your notes, right? Get ready to answer the question that I pose to you. Now, even though you don't know the question I'm posing to you, well, if you're watching this video, I'm hoping that I can give you enough information so that way you are not surprised and you are ready to go to answer the question, okay? So for the final Proctor exam, what you have been doing for preparation is Module 9 and 10. Right? Module 9 and 10 cover American history after World War II and the end of the Cold War. So we're talking about 1945 up until 1991. And I hope you have enjoyed what you have learned in the modules, covering everything from the origins of the Cold War and ultimately and the various effort to fight against communism overseas, and also understanding how the Cold War shapes events back at home with somewhat the second Red Scare, with McCarthyism in the 1950s, and ultimately you have the rise of the civil rights movement and the various other somewhat liberation movement, if you will, the anti-war protests, the feminist movement, and so many other movements throughout the 1960s and 70s, if you will. So that's what you have been looking at. So I hope you have enjoyed covering those topics, and also covering some of the films and the debate. So you watched the My Lai documentary on the Vietnam War. That is a personal topic of interest for me, simply because obviously I am Vietnamese. So my family and I, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Vietnam War. And also you have examined the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment, the RA, and the complexities as to how America pushed for legislation in terms of women's rights, right? Oftentimes it's complicated because those who oppose it are not only men, but also women, as Phyllis Schlafly pointed out. So I hope you enjoy somewhat understanding those complexities within those debates, if you will. So I want to talk to you about your final Proctor exam, what it's going to cover entails. So again, you don't know the essay prompt, but I'm hoping that through my discussion of the documents and the terms, it's going to give you a better general understanding of what to expect on the final Proctor exam. Okay, so just based on the content that you have covered, right? Like chapter 28, 29, 30, and 31, right? obviously, you know you're going to get tests on the Cold War. Like, you just can't talk about those years without talking about the Cold War, okay? And the Cold War itself, right, was a war not just against the Russians, not just against a country, but the Cold War itself was a war of ideologies, right? It's a war of societies. Basically, America was trying to prove to the rest of the world that it was a superior, a better society, because it was a freer society and ultimately a more equal society. Let's just put it that way, right? That America is a wonderful place. America is a free place, is the country where you want to live, right? In the context of the Cold War. So what's the opposite, right? The opposite of that is you have the communists, right? That rule their people with somewhat like an iron fist, if you will. It's a totalitarian government that suppresses people's rights to religion, to the press, right? You don't really have rights under a communist regime. And ultimately, the government owns everything in a communist society. This is part of the reason why America hates communism so much, right? That America is about the individual. America is about private entrepreneurship. It's about your merits. It's about your talent, and it's about the accumulation of wealth, right? Like let's not kid ourselves here. The reason why we wake up in the morning to go to work is, let's just face it, guys, we want to make money, right? Like at the end of the day, money, I guess in a way, Wu-Tang Clan, if you're a fan of hip hop rap back in the 90s, Wu-Tang Clan was right? Like cash rules everything around me. That at the end of the day, right, it's about the accumulation of wealth. And I guess that's what makes America great, right? That's why we work so hard. That's why we go to work. That's why we go to school. And because we want to ultimately make money, and because making money will allow us to buy stuff, right? Cars, right? A house, right? This is why if you look at module number 9, I asked you about the discussion of the American dream, right? It's not a coincidence, guys, that the that the U.S. government was trying to promote home ownership in the 1950s, right? Because this was a way to prove to the doubters, to prove to the people in what was called the third world country, right? Basically, these were countries that were coming into independence for the very first time, overthrowing their European colonizers. They're achieving independence for the first time. So countries like, the Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, right? You got India, and you got countries in the Middle East and in Africa, and they have to decide which society they want to live under, right? Do they want to live under the American system, basically a capitalistic, right, free enterprise? It's about a private ownership, right, private property, right? Or do they want to live under a communist society where the government owns everything, and there is talks of wealth redistribution and ultimately a land redistribution, right? So those are the choices that the people had to decide. Now, I know it's easy in hindsight to say, well, obviously they should have chosen communism, right? It's easy to say that with hindsight. It's simply because we know that the communists lost, okay? But in the context of the 1950s and 60s, that decision was not so easy. If anything, communism was very appealing, right? Because the fact that communism was fighting on the behalf, or making the argument on the behalf of people that were fighting for their independence against their European colonizers, against imperialism, right? And also against racism, okay? Like, that was the reason why communism was so appealing, right? For people of color around the world in particular. The fact that they saw capitalism, they saw the American system as exploitation, right? Of the rich against the poor, of white against black, right? That was why communism was so appealing, right? And the idea that you would redistribute land, redistribute wealth, that was very appealing, especially to people who were from poor, impoverished countries. So it's easy in hindsight to say, yeah, they should have chosen America, but it's not so easy. So that's the context of the Cold War, right? The Cold War is this war of ideologies. It's this war of societies, right? And it's a war against communism. So 1947, President Harry Truman, he sees communism expanding, right, in Europe, in the Middle East in particular, and he's very alarmed. So as a result, he goes in front of Congress and he makes a speech, okay? And he asks for money. He asks for assistance to go help countries like Turkey and Greece to fight against communism. But as he makes his speech, right, he lays the foundation for American foreign policies for the next 44 years to come. Now, even though he doesn't call out the communists by name, look, everybody knows who he's talking about. He says, look, people have the choice whether they want to live in a free society or whether they want to live in a oppressed society, a totalitarian society. Those are their choices, right? Obviously, America is the free choice and totalitarianism is communism, right? And he makes a declaration that any country that wants to live in a free democratic society, right, America will come to their assistance. America will defend them. And in a single speech, right, he lays the foundation of American foreign policies for the next 44 years to come. We call it the Truman Doctrine, right? And the Truman Doctrine, the game plan is simple. Stop communism. That's it, right? Contain communism. Stop communism from expanding. If you can stop communism, it will collapse on its own. So you got to do everything you can to stop communism, okay? So that's the Truman Doctrine, okay? And ultimately, for the next 44 years, from 1947 to 1991, America is going to commit itself to this all-out war against communism, right? So maybe what you might want to think carefully, and this is me hinting to you, is that you might want to think about those efforts, right? How successful was America in fighting communism? I can't make it clearer than that, guys. Start thinking about that, right? Think about events in Europe, okay? Think about events in Latin America, right? And think about events in Asia, okay? Because communism was expanding in all of those places. And if the Truman Doctrine says, basically, the Truman Doctrine says, I apologize for that. Let me get back. Sorry. So if the Truman Doctrine says that America is going to fight against communism, right, to come to the defense of any country that wants to resist communism, like I said, you might want to start identifying, right, examples and places that America tried to fulfill those promises, right? So some places you might want to consider Europe, right? Looking at Europe, right, after World War II and the plan to rebuild Europe, okay? You might want to look at Korea, okay? You also might want to look at Cuba. And last but not least, of course, you got to look at Vietnam, okay? So those are the big topics that I'm letting you know right now to pay close attention to, because why? You got documents that somewhat talks about that, okay? So ultimately, here's document number 1. You have a map of the Korean War, right? This is my way of letting you know, hey, think about the Korean War and how it relates to the Truman Doctrine, right? If the Korean War is an example of America trying to fight against communism or to contain communism, how successful was it? Was it a success? How do you define success, right? What is your assessment of success, right? under the Truman Doctrine. Because if the goal is to contain communism, right, did the Korean War succeed in doing that? Right? So this is my way of letting you know, hey, talk about the Korean War. Okay? Let's see. I want to jump to some other ones here that might be related. Okay? Document number 6. Okay? Here you have an image of the last helicopter to get out of the capital of South Vietnam, of Saigon. Okay? This is the iconic picture of the fall of Saigon. Right? This was the last ticket out, right, for American personnel and any of their Vietnamese allies. If you didn't get on this last helicopter, you're kind of out of luck. Right? You got to risk your lives on the boats. You got to risk your lives out in the ocean. So this is the last somewhat ticket out. So this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Vietnam War or think about the Vietnam War and how it relates to the Truman Doctrine. Does the Vietnam War prove that the Truman Doctrine was a success or a failure? Right? If the objective of the Truman Doctrine is to stop communism, did the Vietnam War succeed in that? What is your assessment? Okay? So you have document number 6 there. Okay? Here you have document number 8. This is a speech by Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947. And what he's talking about is basically the need for America to rebuild Europe in its effort to fight communism, right? That ultimately, if you can win the allegiance, right, of Europeans through financial assistance, right, they will help you fight against communism, right? And by helping those people in Europe, right, improve their economic conditions, right, free societies will thrive. You have to convince them that America is a better society. So this is called the Marshall Plan speech. So this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about somewhat the Marshall Plan and its effort to rebuild Europe. How successful was it, right? Give me the context, okay? So with all of these events, just think about it, right? Think about the context, right? Think about how they correlate to the Truman Doctrine and America's effort to fight communism overseas, okay? That's as far as I go, short of revealing to you the essay prompt. So that's what you want to pay close attention to, okay? So there's 3 documents right there, okay? Now, the other documents are somewhat kind of tricky, and you're going to have to piece this together. But what I'm hoping you to understand is that the Cold War itself wasn't just about a fight against communism overseas, but was also a battle to try to win allegiance at home. That some people didn't believe in the promises of America. Now, this is not the first time that you have come across this concept that there are some people in America that would doubt the promises of America overseas. World War I, Spanish-American War, the Philippines-American War, we have come across this concept before, right? And it's no different during the Cold War. Because after World War II, there was a sense among people of color, African Americans in particular, that they're not going to go back to the old ways, right? Like, this is going to be different, okay? And ultimately, they were inspired by the promises of World War II, that they were fighting for the 4 freedoms, right? Freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of religion, and freedom from speech, right? But they're also fighting, if you remember, you have the double V campaign, victory against racism overseas and victory against racism at home. Now, the victory against racism overseas, that's done, right? World War II is over. Hitler's done with, okay? Now the real battle begins for African Americans back at home, right? It's about fighting for democracy at home. And ultimately what you have is, well, some historians make the argument that the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s right? With Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and the March on Washington. None of that would have happened if it wasn't for the Cold War or the promises of the Cold War. Because if you really think about it, African Americans demanding for their civil rights, that's nothing new. We've seen this before, right? After Reconstruction, after World War I, right? And again after World War II. But there was something different about what happened after World War II that inspired, that motivated, that emboldened, right? Empower African Americans in their fight for civil rights. And some historians make the argument, right? It was the Cold War, right? For a couple of reasons. It's simply because, well, if you are going to say that you are the most powerful country on earth, you are the greatest country on earth, and you are the freest country on earth, well, damn it, you better fulfill those promises, right? And the Cold War, what it does, it puts America even under greater scrutiny to fulfill those promises. Because not only does America have to win allegiance of countries in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East for their loyalty, for their allegiance, but the Soviets were using, right, segregation and the mistreatment of African Americans back at home, right, against the American government. For example, let me show you. Here you have Russian propaganda in 1968. And the title of this painting is called The Shame of America. And I think based on the picture, based on this poster, it's quite clear what the idea is. Here you have an African American. He's laying in a puddle of blood, and the backdrop is New York City, right? I think it's quite clear that the Russians are calling America out on its bullshit, right? Let's call it what it is. This is bullshit, right? And calling America out for its racism, right? Right? And its hypocrisy as to how it's treating African Americans back at home. Just think about it. How can you say that you are the freest, the most democratic country on earth when this is happening to your own citizens? It's not right, right? And this was not lost upon the Soviets. They knew exactly how to exploit this as propaganda. So I want to show you a couple of other ones, okay? Right here you have the Statue of Liberty, right? Lynching African Americans. Now this propaganda actually dated back as early as the 1930s, right? So we know that tension between America and the Russians have never been good, okay? So again, this idea of using African Americans, segregation, lynchings, right, as a way to call America out on its hypocrisy. And I want to show you another one. This is communist propaganda, right, using what happened in Arkansas. It was called the Little Rock incident, where you have 9 African American students trying to go to this high school. The Supreme Court had ordered the Brown versus Board decision to integrate the schools. The governor of Arkansas, he refused. And as a result, Eisenhower, he's somewhat reluctant to take actions at first, but eventually he's forced to get involved. And the reason why he's forced to get involved is because of propaganda like this, right? Here you have Russian propaganda, right? Using what had happened in the Little Rock 9 incident as a way to call America out on its hypocrisy. And why am I telling you this? Is because that's going to be the familiar theme that you're going to read, right, in some of the documents, right? You're going to see that theme between the American promises during the Cold War and how it has an impact on movements back at home. Okay, so I show you that propaganda poster. Here's document number 4, right? And this is an excellent document. This is a speech that was given by President Dwight Eisenhower addressing, right, the Little Rock incident. And he's trying to explain the reason why he had to send in the National Guard. Okay? Read this very carefully because it's going to make that connection between events happening overseas, the Cold War, and the civil rights movement back at home, right? And I want you to read this passage very carefully, right? Where he writes, where he says, our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation, right? He's talking, what enemy? What incident? How are they using it, right? And think about it. How does this put pressure on the US government to act on civil rights? And how will African Americans use this to their advantage? Just think about it, okay? That is what you should have to consider. How does the Cold War, right, puts pressure on America at home to push for civil rights? And how do African Americans in particular in the civil rights movement use the Cold War to their advantage, to call America out on its hypocrisy and to call America, to hold America accountable for its promises, okay? Because that's what the documents are going to reveal to you. So if you read the documents very carefully, document number 2, here's a letter written by Martin Luther King, right? Letter from a Birmingham jail. He's writing this from jail. This is the famous letter, right? 1960. I really love this letter because it connects the dots that I want you to connect, right? It's talking about what's happening overseas and how it's having impact on the civil rights movement at home. Look at the first 2 sentences, okay? He writes, we have waited more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Okay, what is he saying here? He's talking about, look at what's happening in Asia and in Africa. Those people have more rights than we do here, back at home, right? Just think about that for a second, right? That African Americans in America, right, were experiencing less rights, less freedom than those in third world countries. That was not lost upon Martin Luther King, right? That was something that he understood, right? He needed to call America out for. So I'm just letting you know, make that connection between the Cold War, right? The rhetoric of the Cold War, the promises of the Cold War, and the civil rights movement back at home, okay? You have another document, document number 7. This is another civil rights leader. It's very different from Martin Luther King. This is Malcolm X, right? Very radical, very militant, right? Speaker and leader of the civil rights movement, right? And I really love this document. It's called the Ballot or the Bullet. And very similar concept. At first, he's describing to you what African Americans had to endure in America in the 1960s. He says, look what we have to put up with, right? And then I really love the part where he makes that connection between what's happening overseas and what's going on back at home. He says, the reason why we have to endure this is because the government has failed us. Why has the government failed us? He says, America is just as much a colonial power as England ever was, as France ever was. If anything, she's even a worse colonial power because of the hypocrisy, right? That on the one hand, how can you say that you promise freedom and democracy? On the other hand, you still disfranchise us, lynch us, and segregate us because of our skin color. Now, right? How does that put pressure on the U.S. government, right? Again, I'm going to show you that propaganda, Russian propaganda. How does that put pressure on the U.S. government to fulfill its promises? Something to think about, right? Those are the connections that I want you to somewhat make, okay? And last but not least, there is something else. There is another somewhat movement that I want you to think about. Not only was it the civil rights movement, but there is also another movement that is going to respond to the civil rights, right? And ultimately, try to reverse some of the achievements of the civil rights movement. And what are we talking about? We are talking about the new right, right? These were Americans who were conservative, religious, right, and white, living in the suburbs. They are watching the inner cities burning up in flames. They are watching African Americans rising up, demanding for not only rights, but Black power. Right? They see that as dangerous. They see Black power as reverse discrimination. Right? They are watching feminists, right, protesting, marching in the streets, right, demanding for better pay, not only better pay, but access to education, but also, right, contraceptives, right, access to abortion, right. They are very alarmed by that. They are also watching, right, protesters, right, college activists, right, refusing to go to class, right, holding strikes, right, causing all sorts of chaos in the streets, right. And for many of these folks, they look at all of those elements within the civil rights movement, within the other liberation movement, with danger, right? They are very alarmed by what they see. If anything, they view the civil rights movement as being unpatriotic, un-American, right? Guys like Martin Luther King, right? We celebrate Martin Luther King as a hero. However, may I remind you that Martin Luther King, right, was vilified as a communist, because anybody that opposed the US government effort to fight against communism, right, was deemed a communist. And anybody that wasn't rallying behind the flag, falling in line with what the US government was saying, right, was unpatriotic, right, was a communist. Now, this is coming from the suburbs. This is coming from what we call the new right. And these folks are going to come back with a vengeance in the 1970s and the 1980s. Okay? So think about the rise of the new right as well, because they also understand that the fight against communism overseas, right, and also the fight against communism at home has to be won, right? And they are looking at the civil rights movement with a lot of fear and with great alarm, right? They don't like what they see. And they also don't like the idea that African Americans, many minorities groups, are asking for, right, government programs, welfare assistance, right, affirmative action, equal pay, equal rights. They see that as a threat, because why? That is talking about, that is demanding for larger government, an expansion of government power. And when you expand government power and when you expand welfare programs, well, anytime when you do that, you get criticized as being a potential communist, because it's a stepping stone toward communism, because ultimately in a communist society, government owns everything. Government runs everything, right? So any small steps to that, right, talking about larger government, expansion of government, is a stepping stone to communism. So some people see government as not as the solution, but as the problem. Okay, so I want you to think about how the new right, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Phyllis Schlafly, how were they inspired by the Cold War, by the fight against communism, right? And how it shapes their policies. Okay, guys? So at the end of the day, that's what you have to do. Okay, those are the documents that you get to work with. And I can't make it clearer than that in terms of what my expectations are and what your test will be about. Okay, so at the end of the day, those are the documents that you get to work with. The key terms, just think of it this way, okay? The key terms is the context to the documents, okay? Because I noticed some of you, you would start off a paragraph with a document. That, I would say, is not an effective structure. use the key terms. These are the small pieces, right? Right, to add to the documents, to allow you to tell a fuller, a bigger, a larger narrative of American history, of a particular group or a particular event. Okay, and use the key terms to build context, work your way up to the documents, and use the documents to validate your answers. Okay. So I hope this video has been informative to let you know what the themes and the focus of the final Proctor exam will be. I can't make it clearer than that, guys, right? It's about the Cold War. It's about America's effort to fight against communism overseas, right? And also, last but not least, how does the Cold War shapes movements back at home? That's all I can tell you, okay? So do your preparation, guys. Make sure that ultimately you set aside as much time as possible to get this done. And if you need help with any of the documents, any terms, schedule a video chat with me. I love to help you whatever I can. But other than that, right, you got a lot of work to do for the week. So get to it, guys, and make sure you get it done before the submission. But other than that, guys, I really enjoy having you in the class. And hopefully this won't be the last video that you'll see from me. But if it is, right, I wish you nothing but the best and best of luck on the final Proctor exam. You're almost there, guys. All right. So happy learning as always. And ultimately, good luck. All right. Thanks, guys.